Our ideas shape our lives. And none of our ideas shape our lives more than our ideas of who we are, what philosophers call our self-conceptions. We tend to think that the right ideas will set us free. The problem is that we have the wrong ones. But what if our ideas themselves are the problem? Many of us struggle as adults to find ourselves, to break free from our old, externally imposed self-conceptions, to arrive at new ones of our own choosing. But Daoism, a classical Chinese philosophy, tells us that all concepts are cages. They cloud our vision. They impose limitation. They take away our freedom. Most people who work hard at it will replace the painful self-conceptions of their childhoods with more pleasant ones. But Daoism tells us that all concepts are cages. Even pleasant cages are cages, and we're better off being free. I'd like to explain how that freedom is even possible, but first we need a clearer understanding of the problem. I'll begin with an illustration from my own life, but I think we can all tell a story that's pretty much like mine. When I was 6 years old, I began studying martial arts. By the time I was 16, I was a black belt and an assistant martial arts instructor. I became an apprentice to my master, who not only continued teaching me martial arts, but began teaching me how to teach martial arts myself. At about the same time, I got interested in the philosophical foundations of the martial arts. So a couple of years later, when I went away to college, I began studying Asian philosophy. At that point, I had enough rank and had learned enough about teaching martial arts that I was able to open my own martial arts studio at the university. By the time I completed my master's degree in philosophy, I'd been teaching martial arts for 7 years, and by all accounts, doing a pretty good job of it. On the strength of my master's degree, I was offered my first teaching position in philosophy, teaching an introduction to philosophy at UC Davis, where I was now a doctoral student. No problem, I thought. I've got years of teaching experience. I'm already a good teacher. No problem. It was a problem. I had walked into a college classroom and behaved like a martial arts instructor. I knew how to teach. You have to have presence. You have to be crisp. You have to command attention. My poor philosophy students were scared half out of their minds. And the most common adjective in my teaching evaluations was intimidating. Now, things have turned out all right for me in the meanwhile. Once I was able to recognize what had happened, I was able to grow into what my more recent teaching evaluations suggest is an excellent philosophy professor. But I'd like to come back to concepts in cages a bit more directly to look at the source of the problem that my story just now illustrates. We've all observed small children as they first acquire a set of concepts, a conceptual framework. They try and fit their experience into that framework. So the first horse they come across becomes doggy. The first raccoon they come across becomes kitty. In the absence of some external intervention, the child is at risk of missing her first horse, missing her first raccoon, because her conceptual framework, her conceptual filter, the conceptual cage that she's in, keeps her from recognizing what's really going on. As we get older and acquire more concepts, the problem doesn't go away. It just becomes more subtle, more difficult to recognize. When I think of this thing as a pen, I see it in a certain way. I see it as a thing for writing. And in seeing it in that way, I blind myself to its reality, its potential as a door stopper, as a back scratcher, as a weapon. The point isn't that we should think outside the box. Thinking of this as a back scratcher is thinking outside the box. But thinking of this as a back scratcher doesn't get me any closer to the reality of this thing than thinking of it as a pen does. Thinking of it as a this prevents me from seeing it as a that. Thinking of this as a pen and or back scratcher and or weapon doesn't solve the problem either. It just pushes the problem back. The problem is conceptual thinking, conceptual labeling, conceptual judgment. It's what puts us in the cage, what obscures our vision of reality and inhibits us from freely navigating that reality. The problem with concepts, that concepts are cages, is never as acute as when the concepts at issue are our concepts of ourselves, our self-conceptions. Psychologists recognize a phenomenon they call stereotype threat. Notoriously, when many African Americans are given tests of their verbal ability and told that those tests are diagnostic of their verbal ability, they perform less well than when they're given exactly the same test, but told the test is not diagnostic of their verbal ability. For Black students who face stereotype threat, merely making their stereotypes, their stereotypic self-conceptions salient, reminding them that they think of themselves as Black in a certain way that bears negatively upon their ability, robs them of their actual ability. There's a related phenomenon that's been dubbed the Pygmalion effect after the famous play by George Bernard Shaw. So-called expectancy effect studies suggest that when students conceive of themselves as having superior ability, they perform better, other things equal, than when they conceive of themselves as having inferior ability. How students conceive of themselves actually affects their functional ability to accomplish things. It's hard to underestimate how powerful our concepts can be in shaping our experience. Our concepts can lead us to literally see and smell things that aren't even really there. In a classic study from the 1970s, people were given perfectly ordinary television sets, but they were told that the television sets were special, that they could emit rural smells to enhance the experience of watching television programs that took place in rural settings. People reported smelling hay. Some people even reported getting hay fever from their perfectly ordinary television sets. We're all familiar with the way that concepts can create fictional worlds. Maybe it's the time we are passing a colleague in the hallway, and we're convinced that he glared at us angrily, only to find out that he's feeling great about us and he's on the way to the restroom. So, concepts affect our experience, and our self-conceptions affect our experience of ourselves and our experience of what we are capable of accomplishing. Now, we might think, going back to stereotype threat, that the problem is negative self-conceptions. But remember the story with which I began. I thought I was a good teacher, and thinking I was a good teacher inhibited me from actually teaching well. So if concepts are cages, we might think that we should do without them entirely. And that's probably the right way to go in certain restricted contexts. Maybe when it comes to hugs or when it comes to punches. But it isn't generally wise to do without concepts. The fact that I think of water as potable and Drano as poison is partially responsible for my longevity. The woman to whom I married appreciates the fact that I make a distinction between my wife and other women. We don't make better life decisions when we have literally no idea of who we are. So if concepts are cages, but we can't do without them, what options do we have left? Daoism has an answer. Zhuangzi, a central figure in Daoism, tells us everything has its this. Everything has its that. From the point of view of that, you cannot see it, but through understanding, you can know it. So what's this understanding that Zhuangzi recommends? It's what we enjoy when we see concepts for what they really are. Illuminating and obfuscating. Helpful and a hindrance. It's what we come to when we understand that concepts are cages. But cages aren't just cages any more than pens are just writing implements. Cages aren't just things we can be imprisoned in. They are also things that we can stand on to get a better view. I've mentioned that I'm a philosophy professor by trade. When I made the decision to become a philosophy professor by trade, the mass of people who had entered the profession during the Vietnam era were scheduled to retire at about the time that I would hit the job market. The projection was that there would be only 4 applicants for every available position. However, for a variety of reasons, by the time I actually got on the market, there were hundreds of applicants for every available position. Shortly after I landed my present highly coveted position, in the face of truly stiff competition, I was chatting with a member of my hiring committee, and I happened to mention that I also teach martial arts. "That's it," he said. "There was something about you during the teaching demonstration portion of your job interview. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but it's the way you move, like a martial artist. It made you more engaging than the other candidates." So I owe my highly coveted tenure track position as a college professor in part to the fact that in one way I still teach philosophy the way I teach martial arts. If I had responded to my initial experience teaching philosophy by concluding that teaching philosophy is this and teaching martial arts is that, I would have gone from one cage into another, from one set of limitations to another set that I just happened to like better at the time. Of course, that's what I did. I concluded on the basis of my initial experience teaching philosophy that teaching philosophy is this and teaching martial arts is that. And I went from one cage right into the next one. But later, thanks to Zhuangzi, I recognized that that's what I had done. And I went back to my old self-conception and my new self-conception with a different perspective on cages. Everything has its this. Everything has its that. From the point of view of that, you cannot see it, but through understanding, you can know it. Understanding that everything has its this and everything has its that allows us to see both this and that, to use concepts without being imprisoned by them. Now, the autobiography I've shared is not so profound. We can all tell stories about our concepts, our cages, that cut closer to who we really are. Stories about the cages that have been the most painful, the limitations that have been the most hurtful. But the essential problem with concepts is always the same, and the solution is the same. Understanding that whereas concepts are cages. Cages aren't just things we can be imprisoned by. There are also things that we can stand on, to see things we otherwise couldn't see, and to reach things that we otherwise couldn't reach. So I hope you'll think about your concepts, your cages. I hope you'll consider what your lives might look like if you got out from inside those concepts, those cages, and stood on them for a change. Thank you.